I never thought the woman I trusted with my life would destroy me. But there I was, standing in our bedroom, holding a crumpled letter that shattered everything I believed in. "He's not your son," it read. My heart stopped. My hands shook. And as her voice called out from the kitchen, completely unaware, I realized the truth. This wasn't just betrayal. It was war. Raymond Jessup had always believed in loyalty. Raised by a hardworking single father, he knew the value of sacrifice and trust. When he met Brenda, he thought he'd finally found someone who understood those values. A woman who saw him, loved him, and wanted to build a life with him. They married young, full of dreams and promises. Raymond worked long hours at the construction site to give Brenda the life she deserved. He wasn't rich, but he gave her everything he could, his time, his heart, his devotion. Their son, Caleb, was the light of Raymond's life. From the moment he held him, Raymond swore he'd always protect him. He dreamed of coaching Caleb's baseball team, teaching him how to drive, and watching him grow into the man Raymond had always hoped to be. But cracks started to form in their marriage. Brenda grew distant. She spent more time working late and less time at home. She stopped looking at Raymond the way she used to, the way that made him feel invincible. He ignored it at first, convincing himself it was just stress or boredom. But deep down, doubt began to fester. Then came the whispers. Friends mentioned seeing Brenda with another man, always brushing it off as just a co-worker. Raymond wanted to believe her, to trust the woman he had built his life with. But the truth had a way of surfacing. One day, while cleaning out their closet, Raymond found a hidden envelope tucked away behind Brenda's old scarves. Curiosity turned to dread as he unfolded the letter inside. "I can't keep this secret any longer. Caleb isn't yours." His world spun. Everything he had worked for, the marriage, the family, the sacrifices, felt like a cruel joke. But it wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation, anger, loss. And as Brenda called out to him from the kitchen, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him, Raymond felt something snap. He didn't know it yet, but that moment was the beginning of a chain of events that would change his life forever. Raymond couldn't breathe. The letter shook in his trembling hands as his mind raced. Caleb wasn't his son. The words burned into his brain, twisting every memory he had of holding that boy, rocking him to sleep, and calling him his little man. He shoved the letter back into the envelope and stormed into the kitchen, where Brenda stood, humming as she stirred a pot of pasta. She turned, smiling, but the moment she saw his face, her expression fell. "What's wrong?" she asked. Raymond couldn't speak. Instead, he held out the letter. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, guilt flashed across her face before she masked it with fake calm. "Where did you find that?" Her voice was sharp, defensive. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Raymond, is it true?" he roared, slamming the letter onto the counter. She flinched but said nothing, and in that silence he got his answer. The anger that had been simmering inside him exploded. He slammed his fist against the wall, sending a framed family photo crashing to the floor. The glass shattered, and so did the illusion he had been living in. "Who is he?" Raymond demanded, stepping toward her. "Raymond, please," Brenda begged, tears streaming down her face. "It's not what you think. Not what I think. You lied to me. For years." She sobbed, collapsing onto the floor. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Raymond hissed. "Mistakes don't last for 8 years, Brenda." He paced the room, his thoughts spiraling. Who was the father? How long had she been lying? Did Caleb know? Brenda reached out to grab his arm, but he pulled away. "Don't touch me," he snapped. For the next few days, Raymond barely spoke to her. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The betrayal gnawed at him, but so did the questions. He started watching her, tracking her movements, noticing every time her phone buzzed or she slipped away to run errands. One night, after she had gone to bed, Raymond took her phone. His heart pounded as he scrolled through her messages, searching for answers. And then he found them. Texts from a man named Daniel. "I miss you. When can I see you again? You promised me he'd never find out." Raymond's stomach turned. The name was familiar. A coworker Brenda had mentioned once or twice. But seeing the words spelled out made it real. She hadn't just betrayed him. She had built a life with someone else, hiding it right under his nose. The anger returned, sharper than before. The next morning, he confronted her. "Who's Daniel?" he asked, holding up her phone. Her face went pale. "Where did you get that?" "Answer me." Brenda broke down, confessing everything. The affair, the lies, even how she had almost told him the truth, but couldn't bear to see him leave. "It didn't mean anything," she sobbed. "It's over, Raymond. I swear." But the text said otherwise. Raymond saw the fear in her eyes, the desperation, and for a moment he almost believed her. But then he thought of Caleb, of the boy he had raised who wasn't even his. And something inside him snapped again. He didn't recognize the man he was becoming. The man who started following Brenda to work, watching her every move. The man who drove past Daniel's house late at night, imagining what he'd do if he saw them together. The suspicion consumed him, eating away at whatever love he had left for her. And as the days passed, the anger boiled into something darker, something dangerous. Raymond wasn't just betrayed. He was broken. And broken men were capable of terrible things. Raymond couldn't stop picturing it, the two of them together. Brenda and Daniel. He imagined their laughter, their secret glances, their bodies tangled in the bed he had shared with her for years. The images wouldn't leave his mind. They twisted and turned, becoming darker, more vivid, until he couldn't tell if they were real or just his imagination tormenting him. He started drinking, just a little at first, to take the edge off. But soon, the whiskey became his companion, numbing the pain and fueling the fire burning inside him. He hated her, but he still loved her. That's what tore him apart the most. He watched Brenda more closely now, studying every move she made. The way she avoided his eyes. The nervous way she touched her hair when she spoke. The tremor in her voice whenever she said, "I love you." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that she was sorry, that it was just a mistake, like she said. But the texts told a different story. He couldn't get Daniel's words out of his head. You promised me he'd never find out. It wasn't over. He knew it. One night he followed her. She said she was meeting a friend for drinks, but Raymond didn't believe her. So, he waited until she left and then tailed her car. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. She wasn't going to a bar. She pulled into a dimly lit parking lot behind a cheap motel. Raymond's heart stopped. He parked a few spaces away, watching as she stepped out of the car and checked her phone. Seconds later, Daniel appeared from the shadows, and they disappeared into the motel together. The rage that erupted inside Raymond was unlike anything he had ever felt. It wasn't just anger. It was betrayal, humiliation, and hate. He waited outside, his blood boiling, picturing what was happening inside that room. He thought about bursting in, confronting them, making them see what they had done to him. But he didn't. Instead, he drove home, his mind racing. He couldn't let this continue. The next morning, Brenda acted like nothing had happened. She kissed him on the cheek, told him she loved him, and sent Caleb off to school with a smile. And Raymond pretended to believe her. But inside, something had shifted. He began planning. He started keeping a knife in his car, hidden under the seat. He wasn't sure what he'd do with it. He just needed to feel in control again. The tension between them grew thicker every day. Brenda knew something was wrong, but she didn't dare confront him. She tiptoed around him, avoiding fights, trying to keep the illusion intact. But Raymond was done pretending. One night, he asked her outright, "Do you love him?" Brenda froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his voice cold. "Do you love him?" Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment he thought she'd lie. But then she broke. "I don't know," she whispered. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. Raymond stood up so fast his chair tipped over. Brenda jumped, shrinking away from him. "Raymond, please." He didn't hear the rest. He stormed out of the house, his vision red, his thoughts a blur. He drove to Daniel's house. By the time he got there, his hands were shaking. He gripped the knife under his seat, his heart pounding. But then he saw Daniel through the window, calm, relaxed, completely unaware of the storm coming for him. Raymond couldn't go through with it. Not yet. Instead, he drove back home, where Brenda was waiting for him, tears streaming down her face. "Raymond, we can fix this," she sobbed. "Please don't give up on us." But it was too late. He couldn't look at her without seeing Daniel's hands on her body. He couldn't look at Caleb without wondering whose blood ran through his veins. And he couldn't look at himself without feeling like a fool. The rage simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger every day. Until one night it boiled over, and nothing would ever be the same again. The night it happened, the air was thick and suffocating, like it knew something terrible was about to unfold. Raymond sat in his car outside Daniel's house, his fingers trembling as they gripped the knife hidden under the seat. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Weeks of betrayal, anger, and humiliation had pushed him to the edge. All he saw now was red. Red for the love he had lost, red for the lies that shattered his world, and red for the man who had stolen everything from him. He had followed Brenda again that evening. It wasn't hard. She didn't even bother hiding it anymore. Her car was parked in the driveway, right next to Daniel's. She was inside with him while Raymond sat outside, drowning in rage. He got out of the car and walked to the front door. His footsteps felt heavy, deliberate, as if he already knew what he was about to do. He didn't hesitate. He pounded on the door, and moments later, Daniel answered. The smug grin on his face made Raymond's blood boil. "What the hell do you want?" Daniel asked, leaning casually against the doorframe, like he wasn't afraid. But he should have been. Raymond didn't answer. Instead, he shoved the door open, pushing Daniel back. "Raymond, wait!" Brenda's voice came from behind him, her face pale with fear. But he didn't wait. "You destroyed my family," Raymond roared, lunging at Daniel. Daniel stumbled, trying to block the knife, but Raymond's rage gave him strength. The first stab landed in Daniel's shoulder, and he screamed, falling to the floor. Brenda rushed toward them, grabbing Raymond's arm, but he shoved her away. "It's your fault," he shouted at her, tears streaming down his face. "You ruined everything." Daniel tried to crawl away, but Raymond wasn't finished. He pinned him down, the knife raised high. "Please," Daniel begged, blood pooling beneath him. But Raymond couldn't stop. He brought the knife down again and again, each thrust fueled by months of betrayal and heartbreak. By the time he stopped, Daniel's body was still. Brenda sobbed in the corner, her hands covering her mouth as she stared at the scene in horror. Raymond stood over the body, his breath heavy, the knife slipping from his fingers. And that's when reality hit him. The rage faded, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. He looked down at his blood-covered hands, then at Brenda, who stared at him like he was a monster. "What have I done?" he whispered. Brenda grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she told the operator what had happened. Raymond didn't try to run. By the time the police arrived, he was sitting on the floor, his hands covered in blood, his eyes hollow and empty. The trial was swift. The evidence was undeniable. Brenda testified against him, crying as she told the jury about the months of tension, the threats, and finally the murder. Raymond sat silently, barely hearing the words as the prosecution painted him as a jealous, unstable man who let his anger drive him to kill. He didn't argue, because they were right. He had let the betrayal consume him. He had let the rage win. And now he was paying the price. The verdict came quickly, guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with no chance of parole for 25 years. In prison, the days blurred together. Raymond replayed the events in his head over and over again, wondering if he could have stopped himself. If he could have walked away instead of letting the anger destroy him. But it was too late for regrets. Brenda moved on, raising Caleb alone. Raymond received a single letter from her a few months later. "I hate what you did," it read, "but I'll never stop hoping you find peace. Caleb still asks about you." He never wrote back. He didn't deserve peace. The cell was cold and unforgiving. Raymond sat on the thin mattress, staring at the cracks in the concrete wall, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the moment his life fell apart. He replayed it over and over again. The blood, the screams, the look in Brenda's eyes as she backed away from him, horrified and broken. He had lost everything. Not just his freedom, but the family he had sacrificed so much to protect. Caleb, the boy he had raised, even if he wasn't his by blood, would grow up without a father now. And Brenda, the woman he had loved so fiercely, would forever see him as a monster. The letters stopped after the first few months. At first, Brenda sent updates about Caleb, his soccer games, his grades, his birthdays, but Raymond couldn't bring himself to read them. He tore them apart without opening them, the guilt too much to bear. Eventually, she stopped trying. The silence that followed was deafening. In prison, Raymond's days blurred together. The routine became his lifeline: wake up, eat, work, and try not to think. But no matter how hard he tried, the nightmares came. Daniel's screams haunted him. So did Brenda's cries. Sometimes he woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, only to remember that he couldn't run from what he'd done. He kept to himself most of the time. The other inmates left him alone. Maybe they sensed the anger still simmering inside him, or maybe they saw the brokenness he tried to hide. Either way, Raymond didn't care. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to pay for what he had done. The first time he saw a therapist in prison, he almost walked out. "Why are we doing this?" he asked bitterly. "I know what I did. I don't need to talk about it." But the therapist didn't let him off the hook so easily. "You don't think you deserve forgiveness," she said. "I don't. You might not deserve it from Brenda," she replied, "but maybe you deserve it from yourself." The words stuck with him, even though he didn't want to believe them. He didn't deserve forgiveness. But he wanted it anyway. Over time, Raymond started writing letters. Letters he never sent. Letters to Brenda, apologizing for the pain he caused. Letters to Caleb, explaining that he never stopped loving him, even after learning the truth. And letters to Daniel, the man he had killed in a moment of rage. He poured everything into those pages, the guilt, the anger, and the regret. He wrote until his hands cramped and the tears blurred the ink. And slowly the weight began to lift. Years passed, but Raymond didn't count the days anymore. He spent his time in the prison library, reading books about forgiveness, anger, and redemption. He volunteered in the kitchen and helped new inmates adjust to life behind bars. It wasn't enough to undo what he had done, but it was something. One day, he received a letter that changed everything. It was from Caleb. "I don't remember much about what happened," Caleb wrote, "but I remember the good times. I remember you teaching me how to ride my bike and building forts in the living room. I don't know if I can forgive you for what you did to Mom, but I wanted you to know that I don't hate you. I hope you're okay." Raymond read the letter a dozen times, his hands shaking. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was hope. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption. Raymond sat in the prison yard, staring up at the chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It was a reminder of the life he could never return to, the freedom he had thrown away in a single moment of rage. But he no longer felt the anger that had once consumed him. Time had dulled the fire, leaving behind only regret and reflection. He thought often about Caleb, the boy who still called him Dad, even after the truth came out. That letter had become his lifeline, tucked carefully between the pages of a worn-out Bible he kept by his bed. It reminded him that love wasn't always about blood. Caleb had been his son in every way that mattered, and Raymond had let that slip away. Through therapy, Raymond began to understand the roots of his anger. It wasn't just Brenda's betrayal that broke him. It was the fear of losing the family he had worked so hard to build. He had poured everything into them, believing that love and sacrifice were enough to protect what he cherished. But love wasn't enough, not without trust, honesty, and boundaries. Brenda's lies had shattered that trust, but it was Raymond's inability to control his emotions that had destroyed everything. He learned to take responsibility, not just for the murder, but for the choices that led him there. He had ignored the signs, denied his suspicions, and allowed his insecurities to fester until they exploded. And in doing so, he had let his pain define him. But prison gave him time to reflect and rebuild. He began helping other inmates who struggled with anger and betrayal. He shared his story, not as an excuse but as a warning, a reminder of how quickly emotions could spiral out of control. And for the first time in years, Raymond found purpose. He wrote to Caleb often, though he never expected a reply. He told him stories about his childhood, lessons about forgiveness, and reminders to never let anger lead his decisions. Caleb's responses were short but hopeful. He was growing up, doing well in school, and starting to understand the complexity of what had happened. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but it was a start. And for Raymond, that was enough. He also wrote to Brenda, though he never sent the letters. In those pages, he apologized, not just for what he did to Daniel, but for not being the man she needed. He let go of the resentment he had carried for so long and accepted that they were both victims of choices they couldn't take back. Letting go of the anger felt like shedding chains he didn't even know he was wearing. Raymond knew he would never leave the prison walls, but he didn't feel trapped anymore. For the first time, he felt free. Free from the lies. Free from the rage. Free to accept the consequences of his actions and use them to help others avoid the same mistakes. If he could go back, he would. He would have walked away the moment he found that letter. He would have left Brenda and started over instead of letting his pride and anger consume him. But life didn't give second chances. What it did give was lessons. And Raymond had learned his the hard way. He hoped his story would reach others before it was too late, before they let anger turn them into someone they didn't recognize. Because no betrayal, no heartbreak, was worth throwing your life away. Love could heal, but only if you didn't let hate destroy it first. What would you have done if you were in Raymond's shoes? Could you forgive such a betrayal, or would anger consume you too? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories about love, loss, and redemption. The next story will make you question everything you thought you knew about relationships.